Connie to cross it without falling off the edge. Try it in play mode. Once Connie is across the gap, go back to edit mode and move on to the next step. You know, this bridge would be really useful to help Connie cross to the next platform. Use X to select all the blocks again. If we're going to use this bridge a lot, we can make it into a group. That way, it will behave like a single element and you won't have to keep selecting all the blocks. Have you noticed the menu at the side of the screen? It appears when you have one or more objects selected. That's the context menu. The options it gives you will depend on the situation you're in. In this case, all the buttons relate to selected objects. Look for the plus sign. That's the icon for the group button. The number next to it tells you how many objects you've selected. You can use this button now to turn all of those blocks into a group. There we go. The bridge is now a single element. You can tell because it has one outline around it instead of one around each block. And if you look over at the context menu, you'll see the group button now says ungroup. Use it if you want to break a group up. But we still need it to help Connie. So let's clone this bridge and place it between the second and third platforms. Just like before, hold L1 and grab the bridge with R2 to clone it. As always, remember to let go of L1. We don't need to test the bridge to see that it's not going to get Connie to the third platform. But don't worry, we'll fix that in the next step when you're ready to move on. Our bridge needs a bit of work if it's going to reach the next platform. This is the perfect opportunity to learn a new technique, scoping in. Scoping in means you can jump into a group and edit the contents individually without having to ungroup it first. And since you can only edit things inside the group, you don't have to worry about messing up anything outside it. Let's give it a try now. Select the bridge with X if it isn't already selected. Then find the Scope In button near the bottom of the context menu. Notice that it's showing you a shortcut for it, L1 and X. So hover over the bridge group, hold L1 and press X. Now you're scoped in. We can now edit all the parts as if it wasn't a group. If you want to really focus on just the group, you can hide everything else in the scene. Just use the Hide Everything Else button in the context menu. The icon looks like a closed eye. There's also a Scope Out button in the top right corner. This is how you exit groups. Try scoping out now. Select the button with X or use the shortcut, L1 and circle. That's it. Now scope back in again so we can fix the bridge. Just hover over it, hold L1 and press X. I think what Connie needs to reach the next platform is a staircase, so use the Move and Clone tools to create a new one. Once you've built the staircase, test it out in play mode to make sure Connie can make it across. When you're happy with it, switch back to edit mode, rewind time, and move on to the final step of this tutorial. Is your staircase working? Fantastic. Now Connie just needs a bit more help to save poor old Cuthbert from his predicament. Luckily, you can clone your staircase group to reach the final platform. Use the clone shortcut L1 and R2 to copy the staircase group to the last platform. Don't forget to let go of L1 once the clone has been created. That's how useful groups are. If you select the group, you'll see a button in the context menu that saves the group as a new element. Saving a group as a new element means you can use it in other scenes or share it in the Dreamiverse. You can't do that in tutorials, but you can everywhere else. Now that you've mastered selecting and grouping, I'll leave you with a thought to ponder. You can also make a group inside a group. With that, I'll let you experiment. Once you're happy that you've mastered selecting, grouping and scoping, you have just one thing left to do. Go into play mode and take Connie and Cuthbert to the exit.
Now it's time to add some finishing touches to this earthy building block. There's no point in adding too much detail to these chunks at this stage. We can always add more later. It's better to wait till the level is assembled, so I know which bits the player will see. At this stage, I also like to touch up the colours of the sculpture using the spray paint tool. When using spray paint, I like to turn up the soft blend and turn down the opacity so it's nice and subtle. I also find it useful to switch on surface snap for spray painting with the wireless controller too. This keeps the imp on the surface of the sculpture. The final touch is to tweak the audio surface type so that the puppet's footsteps sound correct. Now that piece is done, I save the sculpture as an element to my creations. Now that I've made the basic sculpture, I can clone it and customize it to create variants and then save those as nested elements. This means that if I update the basic one, I can update the customized one to pick up the changes I make. In the next step, we'll create some variants. First, I'll clone the earthy block I just made and create a grassy version. When I'm adding new sculptures or paintings to an existing creation, I always change visual feedback to minimal in my preferences. This means I can see more clearly how the creations are working together visually. It does make it less obvious when you're scoped into groups and elements though, so I'll need to be mindful of that. I'll use a similar sculpting technique as before, but in green with a streaky fleck to create the grassy topping. I simply sculpt a layer of grass on the flat top of the earth block, like I'm icing a cake. I want it a bit lumpy, but not too lumpy, as the puppet needs to walk on it. The edges of the walkable area should be nice and clear, so the player knows where they can safely walk. When I'm done sculpting, I go to Style mode and turn up the impasto, ruffle and looseness to get the grass effect. A tiny hint of the wave effect simulates a breeze and makes the scene feel more alive. Next, I scope into the earthy block again and spray paint around the edges of the grass with the green tumbler colour. This blends in the hard edge of the grass to make it less artificial. I also like to add some paint strokes with surface snap to the grass. I give them the same fleck, impasto and ruffle as the grass sculpture, but make them a little bit longer. This will break up the grass and make it seem more natural and less like a golf course. I'm also making another variant with just the paint strokes straight onto the earth and blended using spray paint like before. This will make a good blend between the full grass and no grass blocks. You can also use a green shape set to subtract to carve a path into the grass. I like to make a few variants so I know I can reuse in many different places and that will blend together well. Remember to try and get away with making as few variants as possible. You can always add more later. I also set their surface types too, like I did for the basic block. When I've made my variants, I group each one's constituent parts. This makes them easier to move and clone around when assembling them. Before I start cloning them, I save them all out as sculpture elements. Now I'm done making terrain, so let's go to the next step and make some rocks when you're ready. Next, I'm going to make some small, medium and large rocks. For these, I use a grey colour and a plastic finish. I choose a fleck that I like and set the looseness to variable again. The smallest rock is the simplest to do. I simply create a cube and chip away at it with any flat-sided shape. I do this with stamp shape so I can use a little bit of soft blend. I try to make it look like a different rock from different angles with flat facets of various sizes and shapes. It doesn't need to be complicated. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. Once I'm happy with the shape, I use the spray paint tool to touch up the colour. Like before, I use the looseness, fleck and finish tools in coat and style mode to finesse the look I want. The medium and large rocks are made in a similar way to the earth terrain chunk I made before. Use a flat hexagonal cylinder, stretched a bit, and construct it in striations. The medium rock should be about the size of the character. The larger one should be considerably bigger, the size of the earth block. Remember, it should be as varied as possible from different angles. To finish off, you can go in and subtly spray paint the rocks a bit with the brown tumbler colour. This will make them sit a bit better with the earthy pieces you've made. When I'm making pieces to construct an environment from, I always try to keep the colour palette cohesive. Once I've made my rocks, I use the small rock to create a rocky variant of my basic earth terrain chunk. Now I've got enough bits, I can start assembling the scene. Once that's done, I'll create some more detailed dressing. When you're ready, move on to the next step. At this stage, I would normally start to put together the scene using the parts I've made. I do this using the sketch as a template. As I lay the blocks down, I hide or delete the sections of the sketch that I'm replacing. I also like to add a C at this stage for when we're playtesting, as the floor guide won't be visible. It's just a giant shiny blue cylinder with a bit of wavy effect on it. Assembling the level before I do any detailed dressing means that I can get a better idea of any blocks which might be missing. It also helps me figure out what I'm going to need to create to dress it nicely. As I assemble the scene using the parts that I've made, I can iterate on the layout. Don't forget to flip and rotate the pieces as you clone and place them to avoid any visual repetition. When I'm placing the pieces, I'm not afraid to change the layout a bit. It's a chance to iterate my ideas as I go along. I also start to think about where needs lighting and where I can add contrasting themes to the different areas. One area might have lots of pebbles, another might be muddier, another might have long grass, another might be totally dominated by big rocks. I try to make the scene fun and varied to walk through. Like before, I playtest it every time I make significant changes. At this stage, I sometimes build new terrain variants like this stone one. I also customise the variants I've already built for specific purposes. When I'm assembling and playtesting, I always make sure to fill any holes the player might fall or squeeze through. I'm also very careful to make sure that the player can't get to anywhere that's off limits. In either case, I usually just grab an earth block, some grass or a medium rock and shove it in the hole. Assembling the scene can take a while, but will pay off and is very satisfying. In the next step, we'll dress the scene with more detail. In this kind of environment, the most common kinds of dressing are the small and medium rocks, which we already built, and foliage. Foliage can and should be created in multiple ways for variety. I always start with something very simple. I simply stamp a few streaky flecks in paint mode to create a clump of grass. I use a wax material for foliage to soften the lighting so the flecks blend nicely. The duplicates feet of grass should be created. In this kind of environment, the most common kinds of dressing are the small and medium rocks, which we already built, and foliage. Foliage can and should be created in multiple ways for variety. I always start with something very simple. I simply stamp a few streaky flecks in paint mode to create a clump of grass. I use a wax material for foliage to soften the lighting so the flecks blend nicely. The duplicates feature in the tweak menu is useful to make it bigger. These clumps of grass are really useful to cover up joins in the terrain and even used for gameplay by obscuring the player's view. Again, use the wave effect to make it subtly rustle in the breeze. You can also create a small and simple flower, like the ones in the painting tutorial, and duplicate it the same way. I make the flower white so that I can tint it if I want to. More variety for less memory. I use the draw or brush fleck tools in paint mode to create plants with longer leaves. I use the duplicates option in the tweak menu, but rotate it around a single point to make a fern or similar plant. Remember that paint strokes don't cast shadows, so don't make painted foliage too dense or it will seem weird. I sometimes make the painting physical so it waves in the breeze. Just be sparing with physical strokes as they can get expensive. I turn off the physical tweak for ones that the player will never get close to, as the effect will be too subtle to be worth the expense. For denser foliage, I create a very loose sculpture using a soft blended stamped shape. I usually turn off collidable in the tweak menu so the player can run through it like real foliage. I use the wave effect here like the grass to give it a bit of movement. The main benefit of sculpted foliage is that it casts shadows, so it's better for the thicker foliage and trees. Speaking of trees, I'll make some in the next step. Trees are awesome because they add overhead volume without getting in the way of the player too much. They also add depth to the scene and something for the player to navigate around. Dreams makes it very easy to create them. You can make a forest in no time. Trees come in all shapes and sizes, so I usually make 3 to 5 basic variations. I start by creating a new sculpture using the Stamp Shape tool and the Curve shape. Then I choose an appropriate fleck and a nice dark brown colour. I use the shape editor to make the curve long and tree trunk shaped. While I'm in there, appropriate fleck and a nice dark brown colour. I use the shape editor to make the curve long and tree appropriate. Make 3 to 5 basic variations. I start by creating a new sculpture using the Stamp Shape tool and the Curve shape. Then I choose an appropriate fleck and a nice You make 3 to 5 basic variations. I start by creating a new sculpture using the Stamp Shape tool and the Curve shape. Then I choose an appropriate fleck and a nice dark brown colour. I use the shape editor to make the curve long and tree trunk shaped. While I'm in there, I set the looseness and a little bit of soft blend to merge the trunk and branches together. I clone the trunk shape and scale it to make the branches and roots. It's wise to look at some reference of trees from the kind of environment, the looseness, appropriate fleck and a nice dark brown colour. I use the shape editor to make the curve long and tree trunk shaped. While I'm in there, I set the looseness and a little bit of soft blend to merge the trunk and branches together. I clone the trunk shape and scale it to make the branches and roots. It's wise to look at some reference of trees from the kind of environment you're making if you want a little realism